Why did they ever leave? This was the question that my uncle posed for me about 5 or 6 weeks ago. My family and I were just in Norway, Sweden, and Denmark, and while we were in Norway, we had the opportunity to visit the farm, the Hoven farm, where our name comes from. And about a month earlier, my uncle had been there, and when he saw the landscape, that was his question. Why did they ever leave? It's so beautiful. Now, both of us were there in the summer. I'm sure it's a different question in February when there's snow all over the place and everything else. But then, after they were there, they were able to take, there's a railway called the Flam Railway that's like carved into the side of a mountain, and then you can take a boat cruise out of fjord. And he said it was, and he's been lots of places, he said it was the most beautiful place he'd ever seen. And so we followed suit, and we took the Flam Railway and saw, I lost count of the number of waterfalls, these just sheer cliffs, crystal blue waters, like unbelievable. And then you're in the fjords, and I took lots of pictures, but the pictures do it no justice. They just come like just up out of the water. It's amazing. But we also went to that same Hoven farm and were able to stand between the farmhouse and the cows in the pasture. And his question came back to me, why did they ever leave? And intellectually, I know the answer. When my great-great-grandfather Hoven left that little area of Norway, there were potato famines, our cousin that we met there said. So, right, not enough to eat. He wasn't the oldest son, so he wasn't going to inherit the farm. And so you start to say, if there's not enough to eat and there's not a space for you necessarily, maybe there's some other place to go. And right about then, they're getting letters from America saying, hey, they'll just give you land over here. And it's as far as the eye can see, and you can start fresh, and there's plenty of space. So intellectually, I understand that they left because there was a famine, and they didn't necessarily have space. And when we visited, we were able to stand in a churchyard where my ancestors are buried. And as we stood there, my cousin Gunnar, whose great-grandmother was my great-great-grandfather's sister, he could point, and from the churchyard say, see that barn? That's the Hoven farm. And you see that farm? That's the farm my mom grew up on. And my uncle still lives there, and we visited there later. And he goes, and then you see that farm? That's my farm that I grew up on, that my mom still lives with me. And it's all in this green, lush valley between these kind of peaks that settle in between the fjords. It's the greenest place I've ever been. Just everything bright green, which is hard to imagine because if you look at a topographical map, Norway just looks like a bunch of rock, and then you've got this flat part of Denmark, which we flew over, and it was all not green. It was crops that were golden as they were coming to harvest. But everything in this valley was just, it's the most alive, green place I've ever been. And I found myself asking my uncle the same question, why did they leave? Why would you leave a place so beautiful? But then I know the answer, right? There was a famine, and, right, there was not enough space on that farm for him. Well, then, when we did that railway tour and we were sailing through the fjords, I would go out on the boat and just look. It's just stunning. And at one point, I was on the back of the boat, and you're watching these cliffs kind of recede as you're working your way out towards the ocean. And it hit me that my great-great-grandfather Gunnar stood on a boat and watched fjords recede, knowing that he was never going back. That he was probably never going to see his parents again, probably never going to see his brother, never see that lush green valley again, not knowing what he's going to find on the other end except some promise, right, of land and new opportunity. Why leave? Well, part of it was the brokenness that they encountered, but part of it was the promise of something new, right? A hope that there might be something different where they landed. The other thing that surprised me about our trip to all the cities we visited, when we got to Oslo, I saw 2 mosques before I saw a church. And there were people in headscarves and hijabs all over the place who clearly had been speaking Norwegian all their lives, right? They were native speakers. And what it showed me was that immigration is a thing in all kinds of places. And having stood on the boat and thought about my great-great-grandfather watching the fjords recede and knowing why they left, I found myself wondering, well, why did these other peoples leave where they came from? And I would bet if you asked them, you would find similar answers. Maybe there was a famine. Maybe there was a war. Maybe there wasn't enough space for them right where they were. And that there was this promise that someplace else there was something different. And then I started to think about Florida. Most of you didn't grow up here. Why'd you come here? Right? You left someplace. And it might have been a job opportunity. There's a lot of people that moved to Florida just hoping it's going to be different than where they were. And then they find out that lots of people tried that and were full, right? But this is what we do as people. Wherever we are and we encounter human brokenness, right? There's a promise of hope that there's someplace different. Now, when you're a pastor and you're on vacation for 2 weeks and you know you're getting back very late on a Thursday and you have to preach on Sunday, you might look a little bit ahead and try to figure out what you might going to say. And so I knew I was going to preach on the psalm today. And so I wrote it down and had it with me. And as I stood on the back of that boat, I heard the words of this psalm, that the Lord is the one who delivers us from death, and the Lord is the one who makes us survive famine. Never heard that psalm that way before, but when I was standing on a boat, imagining my great-great-grandfather leaving a place where there wasn't maybe enough to eat, and then I hear in a psalm that there's a famine and death and that God delivers us from those things, I started to hear that psalm a little different. The psalm also tells us that the size of the king's army will not save the king, and the strength of the warrior's arm will not save the warrior, and putting your hope in the war horse is vain because the war horse isn't going to save you either. So that the psalmist, in what we read together today, is saying in military imagery, we can trust in all of the power and might and effort that we have, but ultimately it is God who delivers us from death, and God who keeps us alive in a time of famine. The other thing that the psalmist says 5 times, in 5 different ways, is that God is watching. If you read it again, it says God is looking down, God sees all people, God's observing everything, God is, right, keeping an eye on things, right? So 5 times it gives us a sense that God is looking, watching. God is paying attention, right? And then at the very end it says, it is in the loving kindness of God that we put our hope, right? Let your loving kindness be upon us, God, even as we put our hope in you. We hear often about God's judgment and like God being angry or whatever, but what the psalmist tells us is no, God's watching, and God is full of loving kindness, and it's that loving kindness that carries us through. This is what we could talk about with the death and resurrection of Jesus, right? It's God's loving kindness that meets us in that brokenness where all of our efforts fall short. And I come again back to that question, why did they leave? And I know the answer, right? But then, what is it, right? Part of it's the brokenness that they're leaving, but part of it's the hope. And the hope, in my particular ancestors' case, was their land and space. But I also know and trust that that's not the only reason that they left and that their hope wasn't just in the land, right? Because if the size of your army will fail you, so will the size of your farm. If the strength of the warrior's arm will fail you, so will the strength of your hands at the plow. If the war horse, hope in the war horse in vain, it's probably also vain to hope in the draft horse that's going to pull that plow when you get to that new place. So when they left, right, where was their hope? Last summer, when I was on my sabbatical, I visited the churches that my parents and grandparents grew up in, and I found a copy of a letter that was written in 1865 by a pastor, T. Bernhoft, who was the pastor in Stordal Parish in Stordal, Norway. And the letter begins and says, John Froyam, aged 47, and his wife Sigrid, aged 48, intend to move to America. This would be my grandmother's great-grandparents. They're my great-great-great-grandparents. And in the letter it says, traveling with them will be their 3 children. And it names each of them with their birth date, their baptism date, and their confirmation date. And for each one, it doesn't say it collectively, for each one it says, having demonstrated good knowledge. So they didn't just confirm them willy-nilly. They had to prove that they knew their stuff. And then at the bottom it said they have communed here together as a family annually. Certified fairness parent, signed T. Bernhoft, and it says how many shillings it was to pay the postage or whatever to get this thing done. They carried this letter with them to the United States. They didn't just come hoping that there would be land and food. They brought with them the records of their children's baptisms and their births and their confirmations and the fact that they communed together, which means they carried with them their faith. What I also learned last year was there was 2 Gunders. The little Gunder was 10. That was my grandmother's great-grandfather or whatever. He later was on the building team that helped to build on to the church that my grandma grew up in. And my great-great-grandfather, Gunder Hoven, was on the building team after the tornado destroyed the first church, right? So they brought with them this faith that also helped them to build worship spaces in this new place they came to, not just farms and crops. So I have to believe that as my great-great-grandfather Gunder stood on the boat and watched those fjords recede into the background, and as John and Sigrid did the same thing with their kids beside them, that their hope was not just in this new place they were going, but that their hope was in a God who's always watching, that their hope was in a God whose loving kindness is always there to carry us out of death and the things of death and to carry us out of famine. Værnes Parish, it turns out if you email the Church of Norway, they'll email you back. They had worship 2 weeks ago in a church building that was built in the year 1130. And this is the church that my great-great-great-grandparents came from. They don't worship there all the time. They worship at the new church that's bigger. But when they have baptisms, they worship in the old one. And when they have confirmation, they worship in the old one. And so we sat there, and as I said, didn't understand a word they were saying, except for I knew what was happening in those waters of baptism. And as they were pouring this water in this ancient font, I knew that that's where my great-great-grandfather Gunder had that same water poured on his head. And as we gathered around the table and they held up that bread and wine, I knew that they had communed in that place. And that faith that they had is what gave them hope to get on that boat and go to that new place. We are connected, the body of Christ, through space and time by these waters and this meal that we share. And they are signs of that same loving kindness that the psalmist spoke about, that God is always watching, keeping an eye out, and it's God's loving kindness that carries us through. As we gather today, we can revisit those ideas from the psalm and say, you know what? The size of our army ain't going to save us. The health of the gross domestic product isn't going to be the main thing. We may not use horses, but the size of your SUV isn't going to save you. And all of the efforts that we might put into retirement accounts and long-term planning and church budgets and all the rest of that, some of it's prudent, but none of it's going to make us whole. The God who is always watching, whether we're getting on a boat or taking a plane to Florida for a new job or wherever it is we are going, that God that is always watching is always with us, bringing that loving kindness that brings us grace and makes us whole each and every day. Amen.